Welcome back. It's part two of our introduction to anatomy and to the human body. And today we're going to talk about homeostasis and some of the regulation of different processes within the human body. So before we get started talking through homeostatic feedback mechanisms, I want to first talk through some of the requirements of life. And basically these requirements are things that are needed in order to ensure survival on a regular basis, things that allow our organ systems to function properly and keep us healthy. Now, your online textbook actually has 4 of these recognized or outlined, and the textbook in the classroom actually has 5. And I've included the 5 in this particular slide. And the one that your online textbook leaves out, I'm going to start with. So there's water, and water is obviously a very important requirement of life. It helps us carry out our metabolic processes and also allows for the transport of substances. We all know that a majority of the human body is made up of water, so obviously that should be a requirement of life. From there, we have food and nutrients, and that obviously provides us energy to carry out our life processes on a daily basis. Next up, we have oxygen, another pretty obvious thing. This is helping us release energy from food substances. This is helping us carry out the process of aerobic cellular respiration. And then we have heat and temperature. Now, your textbook in the classroom will mention heat, but your online textbook will actually mention temperature. And having a proper body temperature helps with the regulation of metabolic reaction rates. So when we talk through homeostasis in just a moment, we'll see that a lot of our feedback mechanisms are there for thermoregulation to ensure that our body temperature is being maintained. It's a very, very important aspect of a living person, of a living being, is to have that thermoregulation happening. And one you probably don't think too much about is actually pressure. Both atmospheric and hydrostatic pressure. So this is enabling us to breathe on a regular basis, and we'll get into that more with the respiratory system and how that pressure plays a role. We have pressure gradients that are created within our lungs. And then from there, we have blood circulation that is dependent on pressure. So this hydrostatic pressure allows for the diffusion of gases at the capillary or the microscopic level in our blood. And I want to point out that although all of these are very important and we require these factors alone are not enough to ensure full survival. Quality and quantity obviously matter when it comes to maintaining life and staying alive, essentially. So the human body has its requirements of life, and then from there, the internal environment of the body also has this balance or equilibrium that it's always seeking after. And this equilibrium of the internal environment is referred to as homeostasis. And I hope that at some point in your biology class, this particular phrase or this term was brought up and discussed. And again, so homeostasis refers to that equilibrium of the body's internal environment, and it's produced by the interaction of organ systems and regulatory processes known as feedback systems or feedback mechanisms. The thing about homeostasis, it's a dynamic condition in response to changing conditions, and it's so important that it requires most of our metabolic energy. So the energy that we are generating through cellular respiration, we are utilizing it to help maintain homeostasis with 2 different types of feedback mechanisms. But before we get into those mechanisms, those specific mechanisms, let's talk first about some of the components of a feedback mechanism as a whole. So before we get into the specific types of feedback mechanisms, I want to first talk through the components of homeostasis and the components of these control mechanisms. So depending on the textbook you're reading or the website you're on, there might be 3 components listed, 4 or even 5. For simplicity's sake, I made this little diagram on the right to include the 3 main components: a receptor, control center, and an effector. I'm going to add in 2 small pieces to this puzzle that will make more sense as we move along. But first and foremost, we have receptors that are parts of these control mechanisms. And what the receptors do is they are there to pick up on information and provide information about a stimulus. And I hope that you guys have heard or seen the word stimulus before, but if not, I've defined it here. It's a detectable change in an organism's environment. And so really the stimulus is the instigator, you all. So the stimulus will occur, and that basically sets everything into motion as far as these control mechanisms go. This stimulus could be that your body temperature increases or it decreases, or you have loss of blood and you need to have blood clotting occur. Whatever the stimulus is, that receptor is going to pick up information on that stimulus and feed it to the control center. Well, that control center includes your set point. It basically tells what a particular value should be. Maybe it's about body temperature. Maybe it's about blood glucose levels or pH levels. So that set point is the physiological value around which the normal range fluctuates. So for example, our body temperature for humans is right around 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it'll fluctuate throughout the day. I'm sure you guys have had your temperature taken more than you've ever had it taken over the last few months. And you know it varies. It could be 98.2 or 99.4. It varies, but there is a set point or a value that we try to keep it near. And that control center holds or houses that value. And so when the receptor feeds information up to the control center, it knows what exactly is supposed to be going on in the body. Again, it could be temperature. That's just one example. It could be pH of the blood. It could be blood pressure, whatever it might be. That control center holds that value. From there, we have effectors. And the effectors are there to elicit responses that alter the conditions in the internal environment. So the effectors feed off of what the control center tell it to do. And we typically see this as muscles or glands that are eliciting these responses. And a response example, for instance, could be sweating or shivering. I keep using body temperature because thermoregulation is a really good example of how we maintain homeostasis within the body. So if you have an increase in body temperature, there's your stimulus. The receptor is going to send that information over to the control center. The control center is going to say, nope, we need to bring that body temperature down a bit. So the effector could be these sweat glands that then cause sweating of the body. So that response is basically the last thing to come out of this entire mechanism. And even though, again, some textbooks will identify 5 different components of a homeostatic control mechanism, I've got the 3 here, and then I've added in stimulus and response as small pieces to this puzzle. So a stimulus is going to set everything into motion, whereas a response is the reaction to whatever that stimulus causes. Let's take those 3 components and put them in a real life example. And let's use something that some of you all may be a little bit more accustomed to rather than things in the human body. So let's look at, for instance, an air conditioner and a thermostat and a thermometer. So in your home, you most likely have a thermostat, maybe in a hallway, maybe in a particular room. Mine's in the hallway. From there, we've got the receptor labeled as the thermometer, or the thermometer is labeled as the receptor. So the thermostat is your control center. From there, the effector is going to be your air conditioner. Let's say, for instance, I go into the hallway and I turn my control center, my thermostat, to 72. That is my set point. That is the set value that I want the temperature of my home to be. So to maintain homeostasis, that air conditioner is going to work to ensure that the set value or the set point is always reached. So again, 72 degrees. Well, it's been pretty warm, pretty humid. And let's say this afternoon, my temperature of my home starts to increase. It goes up to 74. Well, homeostasis is no longer being reached. This balance has been offset. And so what's going to happen is you've got the stimulus now. That room temperature rises. Your normal condition is disturbed. So if you are paying attention to this, so we're right here. We've got the stimulus being the room temperature rising. That normal condition is disturbed. So from there, the receptor is your thermometer. That thermometer reads the temperature change, and it checks in with the control center and says, hey, this is where we're at now. We're at 74, and the control center says, nope, it's supposed to be at 72. So the control center, so we got that information being passed in here. The control center is going to send a command to your air conditioner. It's going to turn on. From there, you're going to elicit that response where the room temperature is dropping. That normal condition is restored. We are back to homeostasis. So that normal room temperature where we've maintained, I want to say we're back to homeostasis, but we are working to maintain homeostasis of your home in this particular situation. When it comes to maintaining homeostasis, there are 2 types of feedback mechanisms that can come into play. So one or the other. And the first one I want to talk through is negative feedback. And sometimes these are also referred to as feedback loops, but I've got them here referred to as feedback mechanisms. So in a negative feedback mechanism or loop, we have a reduction of the variable back to its original state or ideal value. So an example of this is thermoregulation or blood sugar regulation. And in the image down here, I'm showing thermoregulation, where we see a body temperature decrease or a body temperature increase. And we are working to ensure that our body temperature gets back to that normal value or that set value. So PSA, most of our homeostatic control mechanisms are actually negative feedback mechanisms. So most of them are working to get things back to normal, back to how we want them to be as far as that set point value. From there, we move into positive feedback mechanisms or loops. And in this situation, the output actually enhances the original stimulus. We move further and further away from that set point or that set value. And there are a couple of examples that I have mentioned out here. First and foremost, we have childbirth. So during the birthing process, this is a positive feedback loop. And in this image down here, we see that the baby's growth takes up space in the uterus, and there are stretch receptors that are activated in the uterus. The brain signals for the release of oxytocin, and that oxytocin causes uterine muscles to contract, and those contractions get stronger and stronger until that baby is delivered. That's something that we normally wouldn't have. That's not a set point or a set value of the body, but in this situation, we need this feedback mechanism in order to ensure that the birthing process goes smoothly and that that woman can deliver her child. Blood clotting is another feedback mechanism that falls into the positive category. In this situation, say you have a vessel that's damaged. Platelets are going to start to cling to the injured site and release chemicals that actually attract more platelets. These are your clotting factors, platelets are. The platelets will continue to pile up and release chemicals until a clot is formed so that you can stop bleeding from that damaged vessel. Again, on any given day, you don't want blood clotting to happen, but in the case where you're losing blood, we actually have this mechanism in place to ensure that we are trying to reduce the blood that is being lost. But in this situation where we have platelets that are coming together, that release of those chemicals, the attraction of those platelets to themselves, that is a positive feedback loop where we have the chemicals being released, and from there the blood clot is happening. Again, on any given normal day, we don't want blood clotting to just occur, but in this situation, we would like it to occur so that we stop losing blood. When you view negative and positive feedback loops side by side, you can see that there are some elements that are the same. And then from there, you can see that there's some key differences. So when you look through these two diagrams, you see that we have an initial stimulus in both. We have a response being elicited in both, but the stimulus, what's happening to that stimulus changes. So in the negative feedback loop, we see a reduction of that stimulus. So we have the initial stimulus come into play. So say it's an increase in temperature. From there, we're going to get a response, and we're going to need to bring that temperature back down to that set value. So for instance, in my home currently, the air conditioner has just turned on. My thermostat in the hallway has the set point value of 72 degrees. Well, obviously, the temperature in my home has moved above that. The thermometer is your receptor. It picked up on the temperature change. It fed that information over into the control center, my thermostat. And so the thermostat has kicked on the air conditioner in an effort to reduce that stimulus of an increase in the temperature of my house and get it back to the set point value or set value of 72 degrees. Once that temperature has been reached, from there, that response loop will shut off and it will come back on as needed. Now with positive feedback loops, this is a little bit different, and you can see that in this image. Positive feedback loops amplify that starting stimulus or starting signal. And we have the initial stimulus feeding into the response, but the big change here is that we are enhancing that original stimulus. So we have a positive feedback loop, as I mentioned, come into play with childbirth. So in childbirth, the baby's head presses against the cervix, and that's at the bottom of the uterus. From there, we have activation of neurons in the brain, and we have the release of oxytocin, which will allow for those contractions to begin. And again, that feedback loop will continue, and we'll have that little cycle that you see right here where the oxytocin is being released to enhance those contractions. We'll see that happening until the baby is born. So usually we see these positive feedback loops when we need to push something to completion. And in this instance, we have the birthing of a child. So when you guys think through these, the way I always remember this is that positive feedback mechanisms enhance the original stimulus, negative feedback mechanisms inhibit it, kind of bring it back down to its set value or back up to its set value. So it's all about getting back to the set value with negative feedback mechanisms or negative feedback loops, whereas positive feedback mechanisms go beyond that set value. And it keeps feeding into it and enhancing that stimulus until something is finished, or in the example, blood clotting or even childbirth. When that baby's born, from there, that feedback mechanism will then shut off for positive feedback. So you were just introduced to different types of feedback mechanisms and some examples, be it negative or positive, and kind of what factors distinguish the two apart. Whether it's blood clotting, the birth of a child, or thermoregulation, these mechanisms are regulated either in an intrinsic fashion or an extrinsic fashion. So what I mean by that is that if we have extrinsic regulation happening for this control system or this mechanism, we have the nervous and endocrine systems that exist outside the organs they are controlling. They're the ones that are kind of calling the shots. So for example, during exercise, your nervous system does a few things during this process. It's going to speed up your heart rate so that blood will circulate faster. And from there, your nervous system also is going to reduce blood flow to less active organs like the digestive tract. And by doing these particular things, we're actually getting more oxygen saved for our active muscles that are being used the most during exercise. So this is an example of extrinsic regulation as far as trying to oversee and regulate this process from the outside. Now, intrinsic regulation, and I mean outside as in outside organs. So when you think about exercise, you're thinking about the cardiovascular system, you're thinking about the respiratory system, muscular system. You don't really think too much specifically about the nervous system functioning in this, but from the outside, the nervous system is impacting those other three systems. So this is, again, extrinsic regulation. Intrinsic, on the other hand, is all about being controlled inherently. So an intrinsic controlled system is inherent in an organ. That organ is capable of maintaining homeostasis within itself. So for example, when oxygen levels decline in a tissue, the cells release chemicals that dilate local blood vessels. This dilation increases the rate of blood flow and provides more oxygen to that particular region. So things are happening in that area, in that organ specifically. We don't have the nervous system playing into it or telling it what to do, or the endocrine system. Rather, it's happening inside that particular organ. Intrinsic regulation is sometimes also referred to as autoregulation. I've said it once and I'll say it a million more times, but the human body is absolutely amazing. I want to end today looking at the major organ systems of the human body because it ties very closely into the content of today. And the reason being is that here we have these 11 major organ systems. I've got them listed there on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I have a very broad look at their function or functions. And as you all read through these and kind of look and see what each system is responsible for, I want you all to realize that there is a ton of interdependence here. These systems all collaborate and work together. And yes, I can sit here and list specific functions: detoxification of blood, the exchange of gases, the sending of regulatory messages throughout the body. But when it comes down to it, you actually are looking at organ systems that all work to maintain homeostasis within the human body. All of these functions that I've got listed and the more in-depth functions that we will talk about, it's all about maintaining homeostasis. And these systems are interdependent. They are not just standalone systems. Yes, you can differentiate between them. Obviously, bones belong with the skeletal system. And from there, you've got, the thyroid gland belongs to the endocrine system and so on and so forth. But they work together and they work very closely together and they're interdependent. So without the cardiovascular system, we wouldn't have any of these systems because we have to have blood being delivered to all parts of the body so that we have oxygen and nutrients and we get rid of the waste. Well, we can put the waste into our blood supply, but then we've got to get rid of that carbon dioxide and we got to get rid of those toxins. So now we have the urinary system detoxifying our blood and we have the respiratory system getting rid of the carbon dioxide. And we see this interdependence, even with the skeletal system, you all. One of the things that's overlooked about the skeletal system is, yes, it's providing structural support, and yes, it has these bones and these cartilages, but within these bones is marrow, bone marrow. And in that red bone marrow specifically, because there's another type of bone marrow known as stromal or yellow bone marrow, but in the red bone marrow of your bones, that is where stem cells are housed that work to replenish red and white blood cells. in the body. And so without the skeletal system, well, the cardiovascular system couldn't function because we need those red blood cells in order to transport oxygen. And then from there, we see the white blood cells playing into the immune system response. And so again, it's all interdependent and everything is functioning to maintain homeostasis and carry out these feedback mechanisms. I can't wait to talk more about this, especially getting into all these different organ systems and the specifics of them. But next week, we're going to talk through directional terms and some more anatomical terminology and get into body cavities. Thanks for sticking with me today. Hope you guys enjoyed today's lecture.